Today in our series entitled Before We Forget, Our Past, Our Present, I'm speaking with Mr. Harry O. Brumpton, Commissioner of Parks and Recreation in the City of Windsor. Good morning, Mr. Brumpton, and thank you for participating in the project here at the library. We'll start out with a little biographical information. Can you tell me where you were born and when you were born?
Yes, I was born here in Windsor on December the 7th, 1916, during the First World War. My parents were immigrants from England in the late 1890s and met and married here in Windsor, so I'm a true native. Mm-hmm. I've seen Windsor grow from to its present size from when Wyandotte Street was the outskirts of town. It's just been a lifelong experience for me to see the city expand and grow.
When were the major spurts of growth, and what years would you say? Was it really noticeable?
Well, there was a great spurt of growth in the 1920s. There was a real estate boom in Windsor, and at that time there was to be a big steel plant built in the Ojibwe area, and all that area out there was subdivided, and many of the sidewalks still remain. It was a big promotion deal, but of course with the advent of the Depression, it all fell by the wayside. The city went into great decline during the Depression. Times were very tough. I think at Ford Motor there wasn't a wheel turned for 3 years. So I have the experience of the Depression. I was in high school at the time. Then following a recovery in 1933, things started to pick up. Things came along very well until 1939, of course, then Great War, Second Great War. During the Depression, the city went broke and was under the control of a comptroller who had the interest of the bondholders at heart, and so things were very tough in Windsor, and they really didn't start to come out of it until the war years and in the years following the war.
Mm-hmm. Now, you yourself at this time, where were you educated?
I was educated in the Windsor school system, Victoria School, Kennedy Collegiate, and then I started with the Ford Motor Company as a mailboy in 1934, December 34. I was with Ford Motor until 1940 when I enlisted in the RCF, and I was away for 5 years. Then on returning, I did not go back to Ford Motor. I went into this area of landscape management.
Mm-hmm. How did you first become involved in landscape management?
Well, my family were all florists on my mother's side. That's the Carters. And my father was a police inspector with the Windsor Police. He was with the Windsor Police 37 years. My uncle, Timothy Carter, was the first park superintendent of this department. In actuality, he started the department. That was way back prior to the First World War. But he was a florist, a horticulturist. However, he retired in 1945 when I first entered the field, and I did that on my rehabilitation. That's the RCF rehabilitation. And I spent a year with Sheridan Nurseries in Toronto as a course was set up under the Department of Veterans Affairs. And then following that year, I entered Michigan State University, and I graduated in landscape management, field landscape management, 1949, I guess it was.
Were there any Canadian universities that you looked at, or why was Michigan State chosen?
Yes, I did. Prior to getting my discharge from the service, I had a 30-day leave, and of course I shopped around. But it was interesting to note that in visiting Guelph, talked to Dr. Tomlinson, Professor Tomlinson, and he explained to me that there were no universities in Canada that could provide the kind of training that I was after. And his wealth at that time was strictly floriculture, everything under glass. So he was the one who arranged for me to go to Sheridan Nurseries, or advised me to go to Sheridan Nurseries. And then following my year with Sheridan Nurseries, of course, I realized how much there was to know and how little I did know. And that's when I applied for and was accepted at Michigan State. And it was Canadian government paid my tuition because there was no other university in Canada that provided the type of training. Mm-hmm. So I was very fortunate. Mm-hmm. I think I was one of 18 Canadians over at Michigan State, and they had 18,000 students.
Quite a few. Now, when you first returned to Windsor, what did you think was the primary concern here, priority issue?
Well, when I first returned to Windsor, it was with the objective of starting my own business, which I did. Established the Brumpton Nursery, and which I owned and operated for, I think it was 11 or 12 years. And then the opportunity presented itself to become the head of this department. So I joined the city in 1959, October 1959, and then I liquidated my business a year later. Mm-hmm. And what, for the record, I'd just like to say what attracted me to work for the city of Windsor was the fact that they had just instituted the city manager form of government a year before. And it was working so well, and I was so impressed with this new type of government that I thought it propitious to sell my business and come with the city and take on this job.
What did they have before the city manager system?
They had a board of control, which was highly political,
mm-hmm.
and I wouldn't be part of that system.
Mm-hmm. Do they still have the city manager?
Yes, they have the city manager form of government. I worked under Mr. E.R. Calder, Mr. Steele, and then we had sort of 3 temporary city managers for 3 months each for a year. That was Mr. Ed Agnew, Mr. John Adamek, and the president incumbent, Mr. Hilary Payne. Mm-hmm. Of the 3, Mr. Payne was selected to take Mr. Steele's place, and so that I really have worked for 5 people in that chair.
Mm-hmm. When you first took on the job as superintendent, then what were the first?
No, I came on as commissioner.
Commissioner, excuse me.
And perhaps I should enlighten you on that too.
Mm-hmm.
Prior to 1959, and from the early 1900s, it was strictly the Parks Department, or Parks Board, and they had a board of management. Then, after the war, they started another department of recreation, and they had a department of recreation and a department of parks, and there was a serious conflict between the 2 departments. So in 58 or 59 in there, the council chose to, or perhaps it was just after Mr. Coder came, but the 2 departments were merged into one. And Mr. Bill Gravitt, my predecessor, was the first commissioner of Parks and Recreation of that new department. And then I followed him. I came like in 59. He retired in late February of 60, and then I took over the combined department. Mm-hmm. So that's and we've been going that way ever since, of course.
So you would agree that that's the best way to do things, to unite the 2 departments?
Oh, definitely. There's just no other way, and most of the departments across the United States and Canada are combined departments. There's very few that are not combined because their interests and objectives are the same.
Mm-hmm. How are they intertwined now? What are the kinds of things that would be involved in both departments?
Well, I think you have to look at a park as a recreational facility in toto. And there's really, I suppose it's like the bird in the bird cage. The parks people provide the bird cage, and the recreation people put the bird in the cage. And it's just that type of an operation. I look on my job as a coordinator. We have 4 divisions in the department: recreation, special services, it's arenas, and any fundraising or that type of business, and parks. So my job is to coordinate the 3 and keep everything moving.
What other departments within the city government do you have to deal with quite
Everyone.
often?
Just this field of endeavor takes you into legal, purchasing, city manager, planning, building department for sure, public works. We work with them, the engineering. It's just it's a type of work that there's no 2 days the same. Every day presents a different problem, and so I count it a poor day if I go home and haven't learned something.
So you feel you learn something every day, even though you've done it this long, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's just there's things are changing daily, and it's been my privilege to see this great change take place in my lifetime.
Well, now when you first became commissioner, what were some of your priorities? What did you have in mind to be done for the city?
Well, there was many things to be done, but the first thing that had to be done, we had the Dutch elm disease. That scourge, and which we attempted to cope with by spraying and removing the trees that were affected. And out of the total, I think we removed 13,000 trees the first few years. And then, of course, there was a replanting program. Then on top of that, we just sort of hurried along. The 401 came through, and Jackson Park was divided with the new Olette Avenue overpass. So with the funds that were paid for the acreage that was taken, we took on the renovation of the sunken garden. A new entrance was created. The South African War Memorial was moved into the gardens and made a feature. Then a pergola was built, and the gardens were lighted. And it's of interest to note that there's over 50,000 feet of wiring in those gardens and 9,000 feet of cable, all buried. So that's what I mean by a learning experience. It was just constant.
You mentioned Dutch elm disease. Were there any other major diseases to hit plant life in the parks?
Not really, no. The scourge was the Dutch elm disease. And like I say, we lost 13,000 trees, especially in Walkerville. It was almost totally planted to elms. Now, since that time, we have established a division of arboriculture. The city now has over 100,000 trees planted and coming along. Many of them are casting shade now after having been planted some 15 years ago. And it takes that long in the life of a tree to cast shade. So, in retrospect, just in trees alone has been an interesting experience. And for a record, again, this time, instead of planting the city to one type of tree, as had been done in the past with the elm, we have mixed up the variety of trees. And you'll notice all through the city, the varieties change. Species change. And the reason for that is that with the seaway opening and all the ships coming up from all over the world, we never know what bug is coming off of what ship, and could get wiped out again if we had all our eggs in one basket with one species of tree. So that's how that came about.
Did the Norway pines up on Giles, or Norway maples, up on Giles, maple die back, I believe it was?
Yes, we've had that, but that is a salt problem. You see, they use salt in Windsor on the streets for removal, snow removal. And the vacuum created with the big trucks going through it sucks the moisture and salt up into the air, and it gets on the leaves and then washes down into the roots. So a lot of that is directly due to the salt treatments the city uses in the winter.
They continue to use salt?
Oh yeah, they still do.
Would you recommend that they perhaps use something else, sand or some other replacement, or no?
Well, of course, we would like to see that. But then there's the problem, the engineering problem of removing the sand from the sewers and the cost.
So this is almost a lesser evil.
It's always a trade-off.
Now, once you started in your job, did you find everything working smoothly here, or did you have to make changes within your department?
Well, when I started, it was, of course, it was after the war, and they'd had very serious problems with lack of money and materials. There were some places where they'd actually used Coca-Cola signs, to patch a building or a roof or something. So there was a great deal to do, and fortunately, I had a very good boss in Mr. Calder, and and the councils. From then on, councils have provided funds, and year after year, and we've just made a great deal of progress. So with this continuing support over the years, we've been able to do what's been done. And of course, we've gone from 300 acres in 1959 to 1,300 acres now. And it's we've had to run to keep up.
Right now, as it stands today in 1981, do you think Windsor has the right ratio of active and passive parkland according to population here, or is there still work to be done?
Well, there's still work to be done, but many of the problems have been solved. For instance, when I took over, we had 33 ball diamonds. We have about 140 now that we service. And any one night, you can find 4,500 people playing ball in Windsor. Now, this is peculiar to Windsor, but other cities may not have that many ball players, but Windsor does. And now we're getting it, and it changes. Over the years, it changes. And now we're going into soccer more heavily, and the pressure's on there. Then, of course, we had a great boom in tennis, and we've had to provide tennis courts. So it's ever-changing.
What are some of the more interesting trivia stories, perhaps, like the bricks from the Ambassador Bridge that you can tell us?
Well, our operation is, many of it is Operation Salvage. And fortunately, over the years, I've had some artisans within the department. Always had good artisans and good mechanics who could do just about anything. The pergola, for instance, and those buildings in the sunken garden were all built by our own people. But along the way, whenever and of course my training to use stone and so on in garden work and garden design at Michigan State, anytime I found any stone, we would salvage it and put it aside until the time came when we could use it. Well, one day we learned that the roadway on the bridge was to be removed, and the roadway had been made of granite sets. And of course, these came from Scotland. They're very heavy as ballast for boats, and then they were used to construct the roadway. But I understand the weight was a factor in removing them. They wanted to lighten the load on the bridge. So, anyways, word came that these granite sets were to be removed, and they wanted to dispose of them on the Canadian side because of the trucking costs on the American side. So we gladly accepted them, but the interesting thing is, as they came off the bridge, the first few loads, the custom officer wanted to charge duty on them. So we said, well, look, we're using them for stabilize the shoreline along here. We're having a lot of erosion. So the first few loads we sent down to Ambassador Park, dumped them there so they could be in full display of the customs. And the rest went to Micmac Park, where we covered about 4 acres with the granite sets, and then we used that as a winter works project. They're all cleaned up, and you'll find them throughout the park system now, the patios and stairways, and all through the park system. We're still using these granite sets. As a matter of fact, we're using them in the new marina. We're using them in the mall, downtown, the new mall.
The new arena?
Marina.
Marina.
Yeah. On the east end, Lakeview Marina. So, and we have a great reserve of them on Mill Street, at the old Mill Street yard.
Did you have to pay duty on them?
They were considering charging us duty, so we said no, they're just rubble, and we were dumping them along the riverfront to stabilize the shoreline. See, we had great erosion problems, but after a few loads, we diverted them to the Micmac Park, and then we cleaned them up with Winterworks labor. They're worth about $2 a piece now.
These erosion problems, do they still exist today, or has that been engineered out?
No. The riverfront parkway system was started about 16 years ago. And at that time we just had Dieppe, which had a sheet piling wall. And we had erosion problems there too, because the water, there was a pumping action, followed the tie bars back. And we had to remove the promenade walk and refill it. It had all eroded behind there. But as we acquired new lands along the riverfront, the erosion problem became a constant yearly problem. And this was, we used gabion baskets, which we placed all along the edge of the river, and these are a basket that goes back to Roman days. I guess they used bulrushes to do the same thing back then, but they're an interlaced wire basket, which we filled with stone. And as the waves hit them, the hydraulic action is dissipated, and it protects the shoreline. So there was a great deal of that went on, and you see the baskets are still there. But however, there's also been a lot of sheet piling put in, a few millions of dollars worth of sheet piling put in, and of course the ultimate will be to have the whole shoreline done with sheet piling.
The final plan here then is to have all of the riverfront as a park, or to leave some parts, or what?
Well, if I had my way, the whole riverfront would be a park, a parkway. Now we have progressed from Dieppe Park, where we now have 3.5 miles of riverfront lands. And while I'm no socialist, I do believe that in this instance we have 200,000 people all wanting to get to the river. And since the river is our only natural resource, we have no mountains or streams or forests anymore, that this natural resource should be available to all the people of Windsor. And it just seems wrong to me that maybe 60 homes or 60 families with 2 or 3 people to a family, 100, 200 people could block off 200,000. So I would hope that someday in the future the whole of the riverfront will belong to all the people. It'll be accessible to all the people.
The portion called Dieppe Gardens now, I wondered why does it have that name?
Well, Dieppe Gardens, the park originally didn't have that name. I think they called it Central Park or something originally. And that was started in the days of Mayor Ream. However, in World War II, there was the unfortunate invasion at Dieppe that was so disastrous, especially to Windsor, where the local regiment, the SS Scottish Regiment, was decimated. And in memory of that, the city is named the park Dieppe, in memory of the many people who were lost at the invasion of Dieppe in France.
What about the Spirit of Windsor that sits pretty well at the foot of the lake?
That's an interesting story. A local writer, Lindby, promoted the salvage of that engine, and the engine itself used to run from Windsor to Toronto, that engine that's there now. So he raised funds to buy the engine, and it came from London, Ontario. Anyways, when it arrived, they just wanted to leave it on the end of the tracks there. And so I said, well, if it's going to be on display, we can't have it look like it just run off the end of the tracks, so you'll have to cant it. Well, that presented problems because they had to put a spur line almost back to Ouellette there, and then come back in on the angle that it sits. So that's why it's canted. But what it does, though, it marks the terminus of the Great Western Railway, which came in, I think it was 1854 or 59, somewhere in there. And so it's a historical spot. It's interesting to note that the railway to Windsor arrived a year before the railway got to Detroit. So the Spirit of Windsor is Lindblad's idea, and I can remember the day that they dedicated it, and they brought a compressor and hooked up the whistle and put some fire in the boiler so the smoke come out, blew the whistle like that, and Lindblad hung out the window with a cap on, and I don't think the whistle's been blown since. However, the university engineering students have now adopted the engine as with their new students, they have to come down and wash the engine each year, so it's become a part of the university too.
You said cant before you canted it. What does that mean?
Angled.
I see.
Yeah. Canted.
And it went in there on its own power? Then?
No, it was pushed in.
It was pushed in. Okay. How about Century Rock, which is, you find that a little ways down? Which park is that in, and what does it mean? What does it stand for?
Well, Century Rock marks the location of a time capsule that's not to be opened until 2067. We developed that particular piece of land as a centennial project to commemorate the centennial. City of Windsor was given $1 per head for development. At that time, we were $104,000 or something. Anyways, it's such a narrow park down there. We wondered what could be done to. How do you dedicate such a long, narrow park? So we built the edifice you see there, the monument, and situated below the rock is a large block of cement with a time capsule in it. Now the rock itself was donated to us by the Ingram brothers, who had a aggregate stone business at the foot of Mill Street, and they had a quarry up on Manitoulin Island, and they sent a truck up and brought that stone back about 24 hours before the dedication. We put it into place. So we're indebted to the Ingram brothers for donating that stone. It's quartz. Now the rest of that monument is of interest again, because talking about salvage, there was a building that was built where the present Cairn Avenue pumping station is, that the city bought. It was called the Matheson Building, as I recall, and it was on the north side of the drive. It was built by Sam Lowe, the famous exporter during the rum running days. And along the shoreline there were a whole lot of wooden sheds, which were the CPR freight sheds, and ships would come in and unload there in the early days of Windsor. But there was a street leading up the hill to the street, and this street was made of granite sets, only they were red ones, and they're the ones that you see in that monument down there. We salvaged them and used them to build that monument. It's interesting to note too that when the property director, Jean Baudouin, completed his deal for the acquisition of the building and that street and hill and stones, that we got there before he did, and I had my men down there the next day to salvage those stones so that property department wouldn't get them.
One race of one.
That's right. That was a constant battle between Jean and I, and even the doors where you came in today. Those were the library doors on Victoria Avenue.
The Carnegie library.
Yes, and the day after the city, the library gave it up, it became the city's property, why my carpenters were down and replaced the doors. And the doors you see out there that you came through into this building were salvaged and refurbished, and they're historic doors.
I suppose we should mention we're at the Department of Parks and Recreation head office off of McDougall, if anyone's interested. Back to that Century Rock, who was on hand the day that was presented or dedicated? What high officials?
I'm just trying to remember. I know we had a band there, and we had Mounties, and Mayor Wilton. We have slides. I'd have to see who's all in the picture, but we had a nice dedication. Mm-hmm. It was a bright, sunny day, and the band played, and the dedication was made. Mm-hmm. So it was a real nice day. Mm-hmm. Well, while we're talking about that particular site, we also had to provide a parking lot to, again, give people access to the river. So you'll notice at that location, and that was the first place we used it, we terraced the parking lot so that the upper level cars can look over the ones in front, and then we sort of stacked them up the bank. So that's why the parking lot is one above the other there.
Okay.
It gives the people on the second level an unrestricted view of the water.
Mm-hmm. That's a good idea. Ojibwe Park, now moving over there. How was that first acquired?
Ojibwe Park was acquired from the township of Ojibwe, and it came about through an exchange of mineral rights with the salt company. The city had bought the West End landfill, what is known as the West End landfill now. That's 160 acres, as a disposal site for garbage and so on. However, underneath the 160 acres, the salt company had mineral rights to the salt, and they wanted to maintain their pumping wells throughout the landfill, which they're still there. And in return for those mineral rights, the salt company donated or traded Ojibwe Park, 100 acres there. And that's how the city came into possession of that.
Would this be the Morton Salt Company or the Windsor Salt Company?
I think it was the Windsor Salt Company, but they're interrelated.
And why is this particular piece of land of value? I hear about this prairie grass and the salt underneath being responsible for low and highlands and wet and dry.
Well, let me explain.
Okay.
The salt has really nothing to do with it. The salt is 1,000 feet down.
Mm-hmm.
But we fell heir to Ojibwe Park, and we were using it as a day center for activities out there. And then one day I got a call to meet two gentlemen from University of Toronto, and I'll have to check their names here, I've just forgotten. But anyways, these scientists had discovered that the Ojibwe Park and the lands abutting Ojibwe had been undisturbed for 10,000 years, 2 ice ages. And there was a plant community there which had over 350 plants living together that you couldn't find anywhere else on the continent. It was a botanist's dream. And at the time, the Morton Salt people had a big sign on the property, "This ideal land available for industrial development." Anyways, I was asked to say nothing, lest it become known that these plants were available, at least until such time as they could get some help to buy the lands and set them aside. Well, then the Nature Conservancy of Canada, and I believe they operate in the States too, undertook to have these lands set aside in perpetuity. And over a period of some 3 years or more, eventually between donations from private industry, and somehow they assembled the money, and then some funds were made available by the provincial government, and the provincial government have set aside those lands in perpetuity. Now the reason the lands had never been farmed is because they were very wet in the spring, swampy, and they had just never lent themselves to that type of development or use as an agricultural land, and somehow they were never touched. And today that plant community exists there. It's a gene bank, in a sense, when you consider that all grains come from, at some time or other, came from grasses like wheat and so on. And the thought is that if some of our hybridized grains and things become so hybridized that they become susceptible to diseases, they get wiped out. So they can go back to this gene pool and maybe breed a new type of stock in that will counteract future diseases or weaknesses in plants. So the basic stock is there, and that's why it's so important.
Does the D.F. Bryan Nature Interpretive Center come under your jurisdiction?
No, that's a separate school.
It doesn't.
But the interpretive center that is there, we moved out and built that ourselves again with our own men. And I have to mention Stuart McKenzie in here. He's the park superintendent. Very dedicated, capable person who just loved this type of work. Mm-hmm. So we moved that building. It was one of the original classrooms that the college out here had on Mercer Street. And we moved it out there and then added to it. And that's what you have there today.
Have you had a lot of similar dealings with the Board of Education? Has there been a lot of cooperation between you and them?
Well, this wasn't the Board of Education. This was St. Clair College. We got
St. Clair
that from.
College.
Yes, over the years we've worked with the board in many different areas of common interest. The Windsor Stadium was the earliest experience I had with the board. It had been turned over to the city. That's an interesting story too. Originally Jackson Park was a racetrack, and the board built Kennedy Collegiate in that area of the racetrack where the school is now. But there used to be a big grandstand in Jackson Park that the track used to go by, but it remained after the track was taken out. Anyways, the grandstand burned down, I think in 1958. And out in front of the grandstand, they had erected a band shell, and there used to be weekly concerts and that sort of thing. I think some sponsored by Ford Motor Company. But anyways, when the band shell was gone, there was a great scurry to replace the band shell. And the site where the present band shell is in Jackson Park was selected with the idea that the bleachers could be put on turntables, turned around for the football in the stadium, and then turned around to face the band shell. Well, from what I understand, everything, the cost and everything was figured out, but somebody forgot to take off the cost of the steel, and but in the meantime, the band shell had been built. So fixed stands were put in front of the band shell. But in the meantime, a deal had been made with the Board of Education by the city to take over the stadium with the idea of using this turntable type grandstand. So the city was stuck with the stadium by this time. So when I came on, we took over the stadium. We upgraded the lights, we upgraded the track, we just upgraded everything. But the old wooden bleachers that were in existence on the west side of the stadium had deteriorated so badly that we took them out and took the existing grandstand that was facing the stadium, the band shell, and turned it around. And while we're on that subject of the stadium, when I, in 31, when I was at Kennedy Collegiate, I played football in the first night game in that stadium. They painted the ball white.
Interesting.
So, anyways, then we added the present field house and the new diamond there, softball diamond. There had been a hardball diamond at Wagopar, which is still there, but we moved some of the lights up to for that diamond that you see there now in the stadium. So, and now at Wagopar, we're reestablishing the diamond with new lights under the neighborhood improvement program. So it's a full turn of the wheel.
Does the Collegiate still have access to the stadium?
Oh yes, we have an agreement and have had with the board for many years, whereby they have the prior choice of days for the use of the stadium. So they use it in the spring for track field meets. They use it for their football games in the fall. All the other part of the year we program the stadium. And then they have a financial arrangement that we review the rate that they pay every 5 years or so. And I think at the present time it's $6,300 or something, $6,500. Originally it was $2,500, but it's not really in keeping with the costs that we're experiencing today in maintaining the stadium. So really it was a good deal for the Board of Education.
No doubt. What other kinds of activities have you had scheduled to...
Oh goodness, we've had a host of activities. The Mounted Police ride twice. Trooping of the Colours, the Essex Scottish, just a host of activities. The AKO football has been going on there, the junior football, for over 20 years, 25 years. So it has played an important part in the life of Windsor.
It was used during this past Freedom Festival too, I understand, for some bands.
Oh, it could have, we had band tattoos there, and many things. So just who sponsored them, I'm not sure, but there's been many, many activities there. And for the record, again, Emancipation Day is going back this year into the stadium. Prior to that, they used to be in the park proper. The council ruled a few years ago that they should go to Micmac. However, they filled the council this year, and they are now going to hold this year's event, Emancipation Day, in the stadium.
I wondered why you had located a lot of your offices and garages and whatnot this close to Jackson. Does that take a lot of work, or is it the location central? Or?
Well, when I took over in '60, the yard across the way had been established to replace the grandstand yard. Prior to that, they used to use the lower level of the grandstand for parks equipment, storage of parks equipment, and so on. Then when it burnt down, they built a 4-car garage across the way here, which we've expanded now to maybe 10 times its original size. Then this building became available. Anyways, the yard is centrally located to Windsor, especially now that EC Road Expressway has come through. We can go out and be on the expressway within 5 minutes. We can cross the city in 10 to 12 minutes in any direction. So we're ideally located. The building we're in now was formerly the Western Freight Company, and we purchased it for $200,000, which puts us right across the street from our main yard. And as you'll note, we've modified the offices, and our own men again did this work.
Yeah, I was wondering about Peach Island now. That has a long history, with belonging to Hiram Walker, and later Mr. Harris's plans for it. Who owns that now, and what are the plans for it, do you know?
Well, perhaps I can pick it up at where Mr. Harris owned it. The rest of it is history that's available. I met the landscape architect who we employed to lay it out for him. He was an American chap from California, Wayne Williams, I think his name was. But what's interesting is that he was going to develop it as a theme island, utilizing the theme of the 10 provinces of Canada. However, the only part that was completed was the British Columbia theme, and those buildings and structures you see there now apparently were built to depict a West Coast fishing village. So that's the only part I got done. The rest was to be each province. The city of Windsor, we first became involved with the island when studies were carried out as whether or not we should take it over as a civic park. My concern has always been that, first of all, it is only in use for 10 weeks of the year that it really can be used. And it is almost 50-50 Canadians and 50% Americans who use it, and they arrive by boat. My concern is that the city not take it over, and that it remain a provincial park, and let all the people of Essex County pay for it in its operation through their taxes to Toronto. So I would like to see it remain a natural island, the same as it is now, has been for many years. We are at the present time having problems obtaining enough money to run and develop the parks on shore, which the people can use 12 months of the year. So I think Peace Island should remain the same as it is, and if it is to become publicly accessible by ferry, I can see great problems arising in that the island will suffer from overuse. It's very fragile. The soils are just silt, built up sand, and it wouldn't last any time at all if they turned the general public loose on that island.
Do you think the city's sentiments are the same? You think the population generally accepts that fact?
No, there's a constant movement to establish a ferry service and this sort of thing. And of course, that's going to present great problems, and that I can foresee a ferry boat that'll carry 100 people or so being utilized, and you'll get 1,500 people on the island, and all of a sudden one of those big August storms will come up, and everybody will want to get back to the mainland, and there's going to be problems. The boat will still have to make 10 trips to take them back. So it's a problem of logistics, and I can't see them overcoming them unless they put a cable car across or something on that order. But even moving 1,500 people is quite a job.
Does the mock fishing village still stand there?
Oh yes, it still stands. The island is being operated as a provincial park, and that's the way it should remain. Mm-hmm. There's some great costs involved in the soil erosion, stabilizing the shorelines there. The upper end are all eroded, and I don't see why the citizens of Windsor should incur that expense. Mm-hmm. I think it should remain the provincial park and paid for by the provincial government.
What other buildings still stand on it?
Oh, they're still standing there. They're made of cedar, and they're not painted. They've let them weather, which they're supposed to do, and they should last many, many years.
Are Hiram Walker's, any of those buildings left?
No. The footings of the Hiram Walker home is there. Hiram Walker himself was interested in horticulture. He had a steam generator plant on the island. He had greenhouses on the island. There was it was properly landscaped. Someone who must have known his plant materials introduced many, many plants to the island that are not native to Canada. For instance, Austrian pine on the island are not native to Canada. But there's many lovely trees over there that someone planted 75, 80 years ago.
Is there any talk of maybe exploiting the history of the island, for instance, Pontiac's residents, summer residents, and whatnot, and maybe that approach being used?
Oh, there's been many proposals. It was used during the rum running days. They say that Pontiac powwowed there, I've also heard that he powwowed down at what we call Goose Bay, on the point there, in the Omerod, where the Omerod home is. The Omerod family told me that he used to powwow on their property that they own. So I could see that happening because that's within sight of Detroit. However, no one's really can pin these things down.
What about some of the other projects out at the other end, that end of the city, the Little River, for instance? What are the plans there?
Well, we have some rather ambitious plans for the Little River area, and as you know, we're expanding the Sandpoint Park. We've established another park down there, Ganachio Park. Now, I must explain the word Ganachio is the Indian name for Lake St. Clair. So that's why we call it Ganachio Park. And the Ganachio Trail is the land that borders lies south of the drive, Riverside Drive, and runs out to the city's east end boundary. Now, at one time, the streetcar used to run to Tecumseh from downtown Windsor, and that right-of-way is a legacy that's we've fallen heir to. The streetcar company went defunct, that line, but the right-of-way remains, so that's now become Ganachio Trail, and we're developing it as a trail, with a bike trail, and it'll all be heavily planted with the belt of trees, and it'll be an extension of our parkway system. Now, Sandpoint Park and Lakeview Park, these new beach properties, will become the focal point for another parkway system that will follow the Little River from EC Road along through the old Little River Golf Course, cross at Tecumseh Road, and follow the riverbed down, and it will emerge at Sandpoint Park. So the Ganachio Trail will terminate at Sandpoint Park. This new Little River Corridor Parkway will terminate there. Now, the Little River Corridor Parkway is 3 miles long, so conceivably you could start at EC Road and jog 5 miles down the Little River Corridor and then out to Rendezvous on the Ganachio Trail. So there's an uninterrupted park system that's possible, and that's what we're aiming at now. We've already bought the Penang Lane Farm, and land is being assembled all the way along there.
Is there a lot of land left to expropriate?
Well, we haven't expropriated very much land. Usually it's a willing seller, willing buyer sort of arrangement. We did have to expropriate the Sandpoint Park, but that was one piece of land with 14 people owning it. 9 wanted to sell, and the other 4 were holding out for a better price. So the city was forced into expropriating that piece of property. But generally speaking, the other one piece of property we've had to expropriate was the lot that was bought by Rodsick. And it was a 75-foot wide strip that was at a very crucial point in the river, where there was a view that if a home was permitted, it would interrupt a 3-mile view straight down river. So there was an area that the situation in the city had to expropriate. But generally speaking, the city has just entered into buying land where there's been a willing seller.
What would you project would be a target date for completion of the Little River project?
I would hope that by 1990, that land would be developed and available to all the people in Forest Glade, and out there's some 15,000 people in Forest Glade, and this will give them access to the riverfront parkway system. And cross-country skiing and so on can go down through this continuous parkway system. So this, as I see in the future, could be just a wonderful parkway system.
How about swimming out in that area? What's that like to swim in?
It's very good. It's a sand bottom lake. Lake Sinclair is just a fisherman's dream. It's a recreationist dream. Really, if you look at it, as I look at it, it's 30 miles long and 20 miles wide, and it's just like a big aquatic park, 600 square miles. And with the new Lakeview View Marina, which is coming on stream at the present time, as I've explained to council, that really Lakeview Marina, with their launching ramps and so on, is the gateway to this aquatic park. And I think in the use it's getting already, that it bears out this contention.
How about pollution and that kind of thing? Has that really done any damage to not only that park, but maybe all of the parks along the system?
No. Windsor has cleaned up its pollution problem. And there's a little story there too that should be in the record. When we acquired Centennial Park from the Michigan Central Railway, that's the area down where the rock is that we spoke of earlier. Anyways, there was an assessment commissioner who was with the city of Windsor, Tom Boyd. He was a Scotch lad. And Mr. Calder sent him to Cleveland to deal with the real estate person who owned that part of the riverfront for Michigan Central Railway, or Penn Central. As it turned out, the gentleman in Cleveland was also Scotch, and they both drank Scotch, and they got along famously. Anyways, the deal was made by Tom Boyd, and we got that land for $240,000. Well, then the city at that time had engineered a new sewer along the riverfront, collector sewer, and it was supposed, as I understand it, to be tunneled all the way along under Riverside Drive, which is at quite a cost. Well, after we acquired that land, they were able to, and we already had the rest of the land between there and the bridge, they were able to come through with an open cut, just dig an open ditch, and put the sewer in, so, which reduced the cost immensely. So between the $104,000 we got for the Centennial from the government to develop the park and the $240,000 that it cost, the city really made money on that park because it reduced the cost of installation. So we got the park for nothing.
Have you had a lot of similar luck in any other projects, or no? Is that the premier example of this kind of thing?
I have to think about that, but that's the one that was most favorable to the city. So, and the reason I mention this is that we get so much criticism about, or there's been so many critical things said about the money that's spent on the riverfront. So it should be a matter of record that if you amortize the total cost of all the acquisitions, and then you throw in this 3,000 feet for $240,000 and the savings that were affected with the sewer and so on, it really reduces the overall acquisition cost of our 3.5 mile acquisition of properties. For instance, going to the other extreme was the BA Hotel property, which amounted to $500,000. But when you include all the properties we got cheaply, it balances out pretty good.
Why do you think there's all this criticism? Where is it coming from?
Well, generally speaking, it's just a very few, vociferous few. I'll give you an example. When we were promoting the fountain, and we were soliciting funds from the public. There were 13 letters in the letter star box opposing the fountain. I think one writer wrote 9 of them. Same person. So, but in the meantime, the damage is being done. And it's that kind of, it's just not general. As you know, the fountain has been well accepted. Matter of fact, I guess just a couple of weeks ago, we were rated as one of the 100 best things in the continent, in Canada. And our fountain was rated the best fountain in Canada. So, we never let those things deter us. You'll never do anything that you won't be criticized for.
Now, how did that fountain get its name, Charles Brooks Peace Fountain? What's the story behind that?
Well, Charles Brooks was a local labor leader who was assassinated. At the time, we were raising funds for the fountain. And he had been active in the riverfront acquisition. He maintained an interest in, supporting interest in extending the parkway system and so on. But he'd also been active in some world peace movement. And the funds being raised for the fountain were a combined group of people that was made up of labor, industry, business, and so on. So at the time, in memory of the unfortunate incident, they named the fountain the Peace Fountains. And it's not the Charles Brooks Peace Fountain, but Peace Fountains, in memory of Charles Brooks. And you'll notice I said fountains. There's one there now, but in the original design, there's about 5 satellite fountains to go in someday. It can be expanded. And they're floating fountains, 2 smaller ones that will surround the existing floating fountain. So, for the record, maybe I should enlarge on the fountain, the background on the fountain. When we designed the expansion of what was Green Park, put a seawall in, and I was always bothered with straight line walls such as existed at Dieppe. And I felt there should be some design in a wall. In other words, you're just standing on the edge of a canal otherwise. So in designing this wall, we went back to council and got permission to make the wall concave, as you see it now at Coventry Gardens, with the idea that we would put a fountain in the center and maybe have water going in from around the peripheral part of the wall. Well, as it turned out, Mayor Weeks has always been a fountain advocate. And M.M. Dillon were doing the wall, so we prevailed upon them to act as our engineer in putting a fountain in. And the mayor put together a fountain committee which was headed by Bill Wilkinson. And one of the staunch supporters was Cliff Hatch of this movement and the original seed money for the fountain came from the industrialists in Windsor who Mr. Hatch, I presume, prevailed upon to support the fountain. Anyways, Bill Wilkinson did a marvelous job of raising some $262,000 by public subscription, and then Ontario matched these funds. But getting back to the design of the fountain, M.M. Dillon found a fountain engineer or a fountain designer in Toronto who designed this fountain. And it's made of stainless steel. It's anchored above a caisson in the bottom of the river. It has 4 submersible pumps. It is sort of like a donut floating in the river with a platform in the center with all the jets on. these air tanks are around the outer perimeter, and we can flood them to sink the center part so it's covered with water. The lights must be covered with water, they burn up. Then there's hydraulic valves that control the jets, and the whole thing is programmed from onshore. Programmer there, electronic programmer. There's pressure pumps and this sort of thing. So it can be programmed, and I think there's some 1,000 variations if your so desire. At the present time, I think we have a run of 27 minutes, and then it recycles.
You have someone on the spot working there all the time?
No, it's all just press the button, it's automatic.
Mm-hmm.
But we can do it, and it could be, music can be put into it too. And it could be played from the shore on a console. We have the console. So it has a great many variations.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Some of the detractors of that project also pointed out that possibly it should have been downtown as opposed to way out there in the
That's a very good question. In making the concave area, the fountain presently covers an area of 180 feet in diameter. Well, if we were to try and duplicate that, at the present time we take the water from the river, put it up in the air, and drop it back in the river. We would have to take and make a cement pad about 350 feet across in a full circle, just to pick up the water that's lands, that's put up in the air and drops back. So you can imagine what that would look like in a park, especially for 7 months of the year when there's no fountain at all. It'd just be like a big parking lot, apart from the problems of cracking and so on and maintenance. So really, what we have is unique to the continent and very effective.
When do you think any additions might be added? For instance, the 5 floating fountains around it, or are there any?
Well, the plans are available, and as soon as the city is out of its present plight, I would hope that financial plight, that again, public subscription, or maybe, who knows, we'll find an angel, somebody will leave the money for the completion of the fountains.
You get into more technical questions about the legislation and whatnot. How do you feel about the 1973 annexation or planning act that the developers of each subdivision, for instance Forest Glade or something like that, must provide 5%? Do you think that needs a little more work, or are you happy with that?
Well, of course, we've never been happy with the 5%. That's minimal. However, it's certainly better than nothing the way it used to be. However, we have a planning department, and they play an important role in the development of the city. And they have been able to get more than 5% from the developers on most occasions, with trade-offs in one way and another. And there's some areas where they've actually got 8%. So, with these kind of people looking after the city's interests, I can foresee where we haven't done too badly.
How about financing? You mentioned some of the industrialists, for instance, Clifford Hatcham, Hiram Walker's has helped. What about groups like the Kinsmen and their Particip Park project in 77? Are there a lot of things like that going on?
Yes. In the early 60s, when I first took over, practically everything that was done under the sponsorship of one of the civic clubs. For instance, the first project was the Rotary Pool in Micmac Park. It was the Downtown Rotary Club built that. There's a new Rotary Club, Windsor St. Clair Rotary Club, which is building the new Ganachio Park. So Rotary's been in at the start of my time and at the end of it. But in between, Kinsmen, you'll see several parks, 3 parks, as a matter of fact, that were sponsored by Kinsmen's clubs. Optimus Club sponsored the Optimus Park, the Optimus Community Center. Micmac Park was named after the Micmac Club, and they sponsored, donated funds towards that. structure we have there, the change building and so on. Many of the community centers were, and the ATO Park, the first community center we had was sponsored by the ATO fraternity. That's the first planned community center. So a great number of the Lions Pool in Lansbury Park was sponsored by the Lions Club. That was one of the first sponsorships of right after the war. So all the way through you'll find the work of these organizations which find their way into the parks system. On that same subject, Joe Lefebvre at the Cleary Auditorium maintains that over the years all the service clubs that have used that facility to raise funds, indirectly, those funds find their way back into these projects that I just spoke of. So one supports the other, and one generates funds for these things.
I understand there's a city naturalist too, Mr. Paul Pratt. Is he under your jurisdiction?
Well, he's only been with us a short while.
What kinds of things does he do?
Well, he maintains the interpretive center out there.
The one at Ojibwe?
Yeah.
And he just deals with that alone? Or any
Yes,
other
that's
things?
his full-time job. And he's a very good bird man. Keeps track of all the birds out there. He's also deals in taxonomy. He understands the plant materials there and the importance of the prairie grass community. And so he's the keeper of those treasures.
And is Mr. Bob Castle still involved in anything out there?
I don't know.
Okay. How about the Mayfair Center now? That was in 71. Is that
Yes.
still in operation?
Yes, the Mayfair Center. They used the Begley School Annex. We built a community center attached to a school. Now that was the first one. That was our first experience of attaching a community center to a public school. And going back to our earlier discussion about our cooperation of the Board of Education, yes, we've had great cooperation. And I'll start with Begley School, where they worked with us on the development of the school ground as a play lot, and permitted us to annex a building to their gym so that we could use the gym and use the community center. Well, that worked so well that the Mayfair Community Center came up with $50-some thousand towards the Marlborough Community Center, which was a similar type building attached to Marlborough School. So that was their contribution to the recreation facilities.
I also wanted to ask you about Jackson Park once again. The fountains there, I noticed there's also a sculpture in the fountain. Could you explain to me what that is supposed to represent and why it is there, how it came to be?
Yes, the gentleman who designed that and donated it to the city, at the time we were putting it in the pool, the city was in the throes of biculturalism over the country. And as he explained it to me, his work represented the two tongues coming from a common base. And if you look at the work, you'll see the small tongue is supposed to be the new tongue, and the mother tongue is the larger piece, and they're both coming from a common base. And to further exemplify this, he took me around and showed me that looking at the rear of the large part of the sculpture of the tongue is really a woman's torso without a head. And if you look at it, you'll see what he's done there.
How about the old bomber that was retired in 61 was there? Can you tell us about that?
I sure can. Having been ex-Air Force, why I'm interested in aircraft. But these bombers were being retired, and Mrs. Cameron Montrose, Alderman Montrose, who was on council at the time, suggested that the city acquire one. Of course, I was all for it. Anyways, once the approval was given to acquire one, Ernie Waddell, myself, C. Southward, and Joe Menzel, Wing Commander Menzel, we flew down to Dunville, and there were the bombers sitting there. They were owned by War Assets, but the one we got was actually meant to fly again. It was in a hangar, and the motors were all mothballed. It was in very good condition. Anyways, we went down twice, and the second time we found a chap who built barges and things across the street, and we arranged with him to bring it to Windsor on a barge. Well, he took the wings off and he put everything on a barge and came down Lake Erie. I guess he almost sunk about 3 times. It was blown off the lake at least twice. But we followed his path, his journey with interest, and finally he arrived in Windsor. And the deal was that we would pay him. This committee was made up of about 16 guys, almost all ex-RCF. We would pay him $3,000. Well, he wouldn't unload it till he had his $3,000, and this was down at the CNR parking lot there. So we all signed a note and got the $3,000 from a local bank and paid him off. But it's interesting that he was quite an entrepreneur, because while we were raising the $3,000, he sold the barge to Dean Construction for $7,000. The last we saw him, he was going down the river, hanging out the door with a bottle of rum, and he was on his way back to Dunville with $10,000. Well, anyways, we got the bomber off at the CNR parking lot, and we put one motor on and one wing, and then we let the people go through it for 50 cents a piece to raise the $20,000 we needed to put it on the plinth out here where it is now. Anyways, the committee raised the money, and the city's actual cost was $1,150. That was for the bomber itself. All the rest of the costs were defrayed by this committee. And it marks, it's really a memorial. There's 400 names over there on that plaque, all of gentlemen from Windsor that were killed during Second World War, RCF. Windsor had the highest per capita enlistment in the RCF, any city in Canada. But we also had a heavy contribution in lost lives, 400.
What about the base of that, where the plane says on the guy? I understand there's a story behind that, too.
Well, not really. I would hope it's designed with the idea that someday after the plane deteriorates, and has to be removed, that we would hope that somebody would, it could accommodate a big sculpture on top, some fitting sculpture, and I would hope that someday some beautiful sculpture will center that rose garden. Mm-hmm. Rose garden's an interesting story too. It was after we got the bomber there, then it had to be landscaped, and at that time the city had adopted the sobriquet of City of Roses. And Dr. White from the Board of Education was president of the Greater Windsor Foundation. So he and I stood under the bomber one day on that little terrace there, and I explained to him what we'd like to do is make that garden into a bowl, which would simulate a compass bowl. So the entrances are all on the 4 cardinal points of the compass: true north, true south, true east, and true west. Anyways, he could understand what the objective was, and he got the foundation to donate the first $5,000 towards the roses. And so we pressed on and built the garden, and it now has 12,500 bushes with over 450 varieties of roses. my reason for doing that, there were, at the time, the city decided to call itself the City of Roses. There were people who wanted roses out on the highway and roses here and roses all over the place, but of course they need a lot of care. And the best way to do it was put it into a rose test gardens where you can go and every rose is cataloged, and we have the sources. Many of those roses come from Germany and all over, Texas, Ireland, they're from all over.
I understand there's an annual public hearing. In one case, Mrs. Fable was able to have some progress with the Great Western Park at Langwell and Riverside.
Yes.
Are there other cases of success like that
Oh,
in these
many.
meetings?
Yes, many. The annual hearing on recreation has been very helpful to this department because it helped, first of all, to identify the areas that were causing the greatest amount of problems, and secondly, it supported our budget submissions. The first one we had, and Alderman Badagello was chairman of the Recreation Committee at the time they were first instituted. We had 48 briefs submitted compared to last year about 12. So over a period of 15 years, why we've been able to put in new facilities, lights here, diamonds there, buildings, change rooms, and all these things have been added to the park system. Mainly a lot of them through the suggestions and support of the people who wanted them. So it does two things. One, it permits us to budget properly, and secondly, if somebody comes in July and says, well, I want this and that and the rest, or would like this and that and the rest, we say, well, where were you in October when we were putting our budgets together? So it's really formalized the process of supplying recreational facilities.
I understand there was a wind barrier built at the 80 Knox Arena too in 1970. What's the story behind that?
Oh yes, well originally what is the arena now was an outdoor rink exposed, but really wasn't exposed, it was a covered rink. And of course the wind whistled through it and it was very cold in there, just like being in a tunnel. So we hung some tarps along one side to break the wind. Well, then the whole thing was enclosed. It became the 80 Knox Arena.
I see.
The 80 Knox building was left to the city in memory by Mrs. 80 Knox Herman, who was the owner of the Windsor Star. And when she died, these funds were made available to build that building and supply the pool, so we developed it into a full complex. And that's how these donations really help, because they expand into full complexes.
Now this year we just finished up at the Freedom Festival, and there's a lot of talk of the way it was run and the location and whatnot. What kinds of problems did you run into with the way it was organized this year? And what recommendations might you have for future committees setting this kind of thing up?
Well, actually we have the facilities at Micmac Park to accommodate the Freedom Festival in one twice its size. All the sewers are there, parking lots, power services, everything's there. And it would be my hope that when EC Road Expressway is finished, which will permit people to come from Tecumseh to Micmac Park in less than 15 minutes, that this type of function will take place at that location. However, the Freedom Festival people tried it out there, and they didn't make the money they thought they should, or they couldn't generate the interest they should. And since the fireworks display is all on the river, and the people come to see that, they've focused on getting closer to the river year by year. This year is the ultimate. They've taken over all the streets downtown, encroached on Dieppe Park, which is a travesty in my estimation. Here's a memorial park that's being encroached on by Carnival. What the future holds for the the Freedom Festival, I've suggested that they take and develop the land next to CBE there. There's open space there. In years gone by, carnivals have used that lot. But my personal assessment of the situation is that I think it's wrong to sort of prostitute the downtown area for a few dollars. I think it could be more tastefully done. This thing could be held somewhere else.
Now, I understand you're retiring this year. I wondered what kinds of advice you would offer to the people, your successor, and the people who are going to be involved in Parks and Recreation in the future, from what you've learned in your tenure here.
Well, I think you have to, the person who takes my place, and at this time it's Mr. Lloyd Burge has been designated to take my place, that in looking back, in retrospect, many times, and I've explained this to Lloyd, he will find himself all alone, sort of like the Dutch boy with his finger in the dike, trying to hold back the hordes. And he'll have no support from his fellow department heads because they have no real interest. It's not their ox that's being gored. But really, the Commissioner of Parks and Recreation is the taxpayers' representative. He represents the taxpayers and should be looking after their interests, and I mean long-term interests. And many times he'll find himself all alone. And I cite the BA property, that great issue that developed, where one mayor was ousted and a new mayor was elected over the issue. And I found that I was all alone. As far as my department heads were concerned, they had no reason not to oppose, no reason to oppose the building of a hotel there. But as far as I was concerned, there was just no way this should happen. And I had to put in a negative report and take that position. And of course, I'm paid to do that. I'm looking after the long range, or have been. And Lloyd will have to do the same thing, because if you deviate, you'll certainly be reminded of what you did last year, what decision you made on another issue. So there's only one way to go, and that's right down the middle.
Well, at this time, I'd like to thank you very much for your participation in this project, and I hope just because you retire, we won't see the last of you, and that's certainly you've shown that you've been very dedicated to the job. I hope you continue with some kind of participation.
Well, my first love now is sailing, so I hope to cover a lot of water